Donald Trump's highly transactional approach to global politics has left world leaders scrambling. And the US president has placed trade and the dictionary's most beautiful word, tariff, right at the heart of his foreign policy. How does this tie into the principles he laid out in his 1987 book, Trump, Art of the Deal? Would this strategy enable him to gain the upper hand with China? And what impacts are there on Taiwan? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Joining us today are Tao Yi-fen, National Taiwan University Department of Political Science Associate Professor, and Chong Ja Ian, National University of Singapore Department of Political Science Associate Professor. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, we'll look at 4 propositions as a way to understand current global dynamics. The first is Trump is all about the deal. In Trump's 1987 book, The Art of the Deal, he set out his business approach and life philosophies while he was a real estate magnate in Manhattan. Professor Tao, let me come to you first. In what ways can you see Trump's approach in the first month of his presidency, sort of reflecting the basic tenets that were set out in that book, particularly this sort of maximum pressure position?
Yeah, I think we can see in his first months, in his trade negotiation and the way he negotiated for the peace in Ukraine, he really used this kind of strategy to maximize his gain in that process. But I think running a business is quite different from running a government. So although in the first 1 month, I think he made a lot of noises, but so far, I think what he will achieve is still, we are still observing.
Right.
Yeah.
And Ian, how would you place the interactions of Trump with, for example, Putin, Vladimir Putin of Russia, or Xi Jinping of China? Because what we've seen appears to be not a maximum pressure approach.
Right, so it appears that Trump has an affinity for strongmen, and when it comes to people who are able to wield some degree of pressure or impose some degree of cost, Trump seems to be somewhat cordial or perhaps less willing to put pressure. I suppose there's a bit of difference between Putin and Xi because, of course, he claims that he has a great relationship with Xi. However, it appears that Trump and his administration seem, for now, more willing to talk tough on the PRC than with regard to Russia.
Right. Okay. And how do you think that will align, Professor Tao, with his ultimate goal, which is competition with China? And also, what we hope is getting a relatively fair deal for Ukraine.
Well, I think at this moment, it's still not very clear whether he would kind of recover U.S. relation with Russia in order to focus on China, or he just want to be very transactional for international relations. So I think when he come back to China, I think he will find it's very tough for he to get what he wants from Xi Jinping, and the competition will resume between the two superpowers.
Right. And Ian, how do you think Xi Jinping is preparing or responding to that? Let me quote some of the aspects of the book, The Art of the Deal. Show strength, get a little wild, trap people, a little hyperbole never hurts, get leverage, never reveal what you want badly, always keep several balls in the air.
So on the PRC side, they seem to be playing it fairly calm. They seem not to be responding very much. And speaking with interlocutors from the PRC, this is before the administration came in, they seem to be confident that they know how to address and deal with Trump based on their interactions during his first term.
Right. Do you think there have been any surprises on the PRC, given what's happened over the past month?
So if the PRC is surprised, they're playing their cards very close to the chest, to their chest. So they seem to be taking in stride a lot of that pressure. They seem to be trying to play tit for tat. So when you have Trump impose tariffs, they impose tariffs back. They seem to want to signal to Trump that they're not backing down and perhaps are trying to push for a type of negotiation that has Trump perhaps being less able to use his very aggressive kinds of tactics.
Right. Now, is free trade a myth? Almost every country in the world has developed its economy behind a wall of tariffs. From the late 1800s, the US relied on high tariffs to protect domestic producers, while the EU continues to provide large agricultural subsidies. China's state subsidies eclipse most other nations, leading to distortions in world trade, for example, in shipping, according to the US trade representative. Professor Tao, so is the global free trade system actually a myth in your view?
I would not say it's a myth, but probably it's an exception in the human history. If you see over the last 200 years or even longer, I think the norm of free trade, free trade has become a norm since the end of the Second World War. Under the U.S. leadership, the free trade has become the norms of the international economic system through negotiations under GATT and the WTO.
And Ian, is that a free trade system, though, that is very uneven? Because, you know, obviously we've heard that the reciprocal tariffs will be brought into place by Trump. And this would indicate that for the US, they see that there are higher tariffs from many other countries around the world. So again, I ask you, is it a myth that there is a free trade system?
So free trade in the sort of purest sense is a myth. There is no completely free trade. But since the end of the Second World War, there has been freer trade, meaning to say there's been a focus on bringing down trade barriers, both in terms of tariffs and also non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, I beg your pardon. And the idea there was that freer trade would be a bulwark against states going to war with each other. It's not a complete sort of solution, but it's part of a slew of solutions.
So the concept of peace through trade.
That's one of the ideas behind the international post-Second World War international system, because the immediate reference point, if you recall, is the Great Depression and the tariffs and the beggar thy neighbor policies that came in the decades before. So with that reference point, the idea was, okay, if this sort of ever-increasing series of trade barriers would be one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for instability and potentially conflict, then freer trade would perhaps take that off the table. I'll also add two quick points. One is that the US actually, in the post-Second World War system, accepted the fact that its partners would potentially have higher tariffs, because the idea was to bring them on board the US system and to use the US market to drive alliances. So perhaps Trump is moving away from that as well. And I would also, I think, remind viewers that in the pre-First World War period, there was another period of trade liberalization then. Of course, it collapsed with the Depression and all that.
I mean, there's plenty of examples where, there was high trading. I mean, the obvious one recently is Ukraine and Russia, also highly interdependent, their economies, and yet that war happened. Also, I think Professor mentioned prior to World War I also, the Germany, UK, and France were heavily interdependent.
Yeah, so I think the trade independence equal to peace, that is a very important theory in international relations. But there is no consensus because the evidence is not very strong. But I would believe it is true because if you compare the behavior of Russia and China today, I think trade interdependence still matters because nowadays Russia doesn't have that much trade interdependence with the Western countries. So it's easier for Russia to have a very aggressive attitude in international arena. But for China, because today China's economy still rely upon the global capitalist system a lot. So I think they will hesitate. If there is any military conflict between China and outside world, I think the impact on their economy will be devastating.
Right. I mean, it's not an absolute trade and also investment. It's not an absolute sort of blockage to conflict. It is a dampener. So it is and I would argue it's an important dampener to have. Of course, it can be overridden by other things such as nationalism and other concerns. But I suppose what we're looking at today, apart from the trade component, is a weakening of international institutions, which is another element that is a dampener against conflict. So as we see these dampeners, these sort of perhaps buffers against conflict get eroded one by one, the potential is that we may be looking at a more unstable and potentially more conflict-prone world going forward.
And that would indicate, Professor, why for China it's so important, BRICS, the Global South, building very strong ties with those countries.
So BRICS and the Global South relationship, that's whether that's for stability or not, it's less clear. But what it certainly is that the PRC hopes to ensure that its key supply chains are intact, to keep its economy going, and we know that it's facing strong economic headwinds. And at the same time, because of declining or at least consumption that the PRC government can't really raise up, it is looking to markets elsewhere too to keep its economy going.
And Professor Tao, before we leave this topic, I just wanted to find out from you, what's the logical conclusion of reciprocal tariffs? Do you think it will actually be a lowering of tariffs?
Well, I think because what does it mean by reciprocal tariffs? Because under the WTO rules, for all the members, they must extend the most favored nations to other members. So if you want to have a reciprocal tariffs, you have to renegotiate your trade relations with your trading partners. So that means...
And the idea behind that was that all these countries benefit from the lowering of tariffs. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in the future, if Trump really want to have these reciprocal tariffs, probably they have to renegotiate their tariff with all the trading partners. And it will take a long time, and I don't know how many they will succeed.
And I did actually want to get your prediction on whether it creates an incentive to lower tariffs, the reciprocity.
Well, so the idea behind tit for tat or reciprocity is that costs will be so high for both sides that they will eventually get to a point where they stabilize the relationship and maybe think about potentially lowering tariffs. But that assumes a certain parity between two actors. If you have a situation where there's no parity, then how much the weaker actor can sort of impose costs on the stronger one, is less apparent. The fact that you have one actor that has a lot more cards, so to speak, can put a lot more pressure on the weaker actor and get their way through. So the idea about lowering tariffs and getting to some equilibrium, that's possible, but it assumes parity, which we don't always have.
Right. Okay, let's now turn to Taiwan. Would any high tariffs proposed by Trump on Taiwan's chips move it closer to China? Trump has announced a 25% tariff on semiconductors, automobiles and pharmaceuticals into the United States, with specific details expected to be announced as early as April 2nd. Now, a 2023 study found that the US imports 44% of its logic chip and 24% of its memory chips from Taiwan. Professor Tao, so as we all know, chips are a source of Taiwanese strength. So do you believe that if there are high tariffs on Taiwan's chips, that it will ultimately push us closer, because the economy will become more vulnerable, push us closer to China?
Well, I don't think so, because I think the competitiveness of Taiwan's chips are not from price, but from Taiwan's efficiency and high quality. And at this moment, if US really want to raise tariffs on Taiwan's advanced chips, there is no alternative for them to get the tariffs. So finally, it will be the consumers in the U.S. to pay the price. So either the U.S. consumers will have more expensive iPhones, or it will raise the cost for the AI revolution in the U.S., which China care a lot. So I think it's very hard for U.S. to really have a very high tariffs on TSMC at this moment. The reason why he threats to have a high tariff on TSMC because they want TSMC to have more production line of advanced chips in U.S. So that's why they have a tariff. And it's also hard for we to become closer to China because the production of chips actually is embedded in a very globalized network. And you must get equipment and the raw materials from companies like SML from Dutch or some chemical companies in Japan.
So Ian, this would seem to indicate that the policy will not succeed. It will not achieve what Trump wants.
Well, I mean, what Trump really wants with the tariffs and also the moving of fabrication plants to the United States is a little bit less clear to me in terms of how those goals will be achieved. I mean, Professor Tao talked about the issue of consumers facing higher prices. But also, if you're thinking about the moving of fabrication plants to the United States, that's possible, but they don't just appear overnight. They don't even appear in a 1 or 2 year time frame. You have to get the whole ecosystem right, the water and your dust-free environment. It's a pretty complicated process.
Yeah, and it costs $30 billion for one plant.
Yes, and so I'm not sure Trump will be around in this term really to reap the benefits. I mean, if you think about the current TSMC plant in Arizona, I mean that's coming online now, but that was invested in several years ago.
You appear to be saying that you don't think that there will be much of an impact on TSMC, on Taiwan as a result.
Well, I think sooner or later TSMC will diversify their production because actually in Taiwan we don't have so much land and resources for we have TSMC continue to expand their production in Taiwan. But I think Taiwan's strategical importance is not only about the chips. Actually, I think U.S. already have geopolitical interest in Taiwan before we have TSMC. And I think especially the current competition between U.S. and China actually is kind of hegemonic competition. And many international theorists already said whoever win Taiwan, who will win the region and the world.
Whoever wins Taiwan wins the region or rules in Asia, I suppose. From another perspective, could Trump be trying to build up the manufacturing, the making of chips within the US itself so that eventually if there was a loss of Taiwan to China, then it wouldn't mean as much of a loss to the US? Well,
potentially in terms of chip making, yes, but chips, as Professor Tao had already mentioned, isn't the only reason why Taiwan is strategically important. It sits along the first island chain, so the ability to manage, oversee, passes between the Asian mainland and the Pacific Ocean. Some of that crosses, well, the fastest routes across Taiwan, that's fairly important as well. The ability to potentially, project force across Asia, the ability to choke off South Korea and Japan, given Taiwan's location, all that is important. So, a shift in the U.S. position I suppose if the U.S. decided it would completely be isolationist, that sure it wouldn't matter. But if it has any interest in, continue to be being a global power, then Taiwan, has a place within that sort of calculus. And I just want to touch very briefly on your point about, whether Taiwan will move closer to the PRC. It's not apparent to me what sort of better offer Beijing can provide. So even in the event of greater pressure from the U.S., what can Beijing provide that people believe it won't renege on? So that's a big question.
A greater market?
Well, it could renege on that too, right? So the question...
In what way?
So if it promises a bigger market, you might be able to get some of the benefits at a certain point in time. But if Beijing decides that it doesn't need, or Taiwan's not that important anymore, or at least getting Taiwan under its control is not important anymore, that could go away. Beijing, like other great powers, it's not just a PRC issue. I mean, you can see this with Trump as well. Big powers, because the cost of walking away from any agreement is much lower for them. They could offer something today and walk away from it tomorrow, and there's nothing you can do.
Okay, we'll go to the final question. So some experts believe that if China had not joined the WTO, the global landscape would be vastly different. At the very least, China would not be as powerful as it is today. Professor Tao, so we all know that China joined the WTO in 2001, and this is one of the most significant events since the Cold War, geopolitical events. Taiwan also joined. And then over the next, since that time, China's economy has grown exponentially. Now some, for example, Robert Scott, who's an economist at the Economic Policy Institute, he said that it would be a mistake to let WTO let China in, and that was in 1999. He said, I quote, "Its state-controlled economic system is protectionist, exploits labor, and represses human rights." Now, the US is estimated to have lost 2.4 million jobs as a result of China's manufacturing sort of might in those decades. So there are some in the US who believe that if China hadn't been embraced and integrated into the international global economy, that the US would still be the major power and the world would still be unipolar.
Yeah, I think hypothetically we can say so, because before China joined WTO, US was the superpower, the unipolar power during the time. And after at least 20 years after China joined WTO, they kind of make use of this free trade system, and they compensate their companies and exploit their workers and the environment to get a very rapid economic rise. And it gives a lot of pressure to other manufacturing workers all over the world. So we can see the pressure to not only US, but to workers in Taiwan, in South Korea, and in Japan. So if we didn't let China get into WTO, probably all of us would be better off. But during the time, I think it's really a very big temptation for US to do so, because during the time, China looked very weak and nice. And all the multinational companies in the US really want to have the potential to get into the potential market in China. So it's hard for us to imagine they would not let China get into the WTO.
Okay, Ian, would we be better off?
Well, it depends on who you mean by we. So in the case of the WTO, I mean, actually, firstly, that's a good example of how China, decided to change things with its market. Many multinationals went in. Then after China got the technology, they figured that they didn't need them so much anymore. So some of that dried up. And of course, now with the lower consumption, that creates further pressure. That having been said, I think allowing China into the WTO, it did a couple of things. If you look in terms of absolute gains, that's how much everybody gains. It did allow for cheaper consumer prices. It allowed for people to enjoy more goods at a lower price. But at the same time, the ones who gained were shareholders, they were corporations, and that came at the expense, right, of workers elsewhere. So when you talk about gain and loss, well, it's a very much mixed picture. Part of the idea back in 2001 was an incorporation of China into the global economic system then would allow it to be socialized and into some of the norms and expectations of everybody else. But that didn't work out in the way that was planned. And so you have a PRC that has become a lot more powerful. So in relative terms, right, it's gained a lot. So the question is, okay, in terms of unipolarity, it's certainly weakened the US position, but it certainly has benefited some. So it's a very mixed picture, and I suppose the debates around China's entry into the WTO back in the day and today sort of continue. If you just care about money, then maybe it doesn't matter. If you care about relative positioning, then maybe it does.
Okay, yeah, and the idea of the political liberalization did not occur, and I guess it points to the question of, who gained the most? It appears that it was China.
Yeah,
China that has gained the most from this, not any other country. Or perhaps you could argue there are some who are dependent on China right now who have gained.
Well, I think, yeah, as Ian said, it's really a very complicated issue. I think, as we just mentioned about the theory of international trade interdependence lead to peace, I think if we still have that kind of a Cold War situation, I'm not sure whether we could have more more leverage on China to become rational and peaceful. But
very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but and in the meantime, I think although Taiwan's workers probably were the losers of this kind of economic integration, but Taiwanese businessmen really are the big winners, one of the big winners in this economic integration.
Right, okay, so Taiwan won as well. We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Tao Yi-fen and Ian Jia Chong, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.